I'm James Pustiewski. I'm the chair of the AERA SIG on systematic review and quantitative methods. I'm really happy to see everyone here today. Before we get started, we've got a special announcement from Dr. Terry Pigott.
Hi, I just wanted to remind everyone that Maddie, applications for the Meta-Analysis Training Institute funded by IES, applications are due on March 31st, and Kamal, I think, is putting information about that in the chat. So please consider applying. Thank you.
Second piece of SIG business real quick. I am really happy to announce that the AERA has run their elections as always, and I'm going to be staying on as chair of the SIG for another couple of years, and I'm really happy that to be welcoming some new officers to the SIG starting after the convention in April. So our new co-chairs will be Carlton Fong from Texas State University and Derek Rogers from the University of Iowa. Our secretary will be Dr. Amanda Neitzel from Johns Hopkins. Treasurer, our own Megha Joshi from the American Institutes of Research. And grad student representative at large will be Xian Zhang from Johns Hopkins University. So I'm excited about getting to work with these folks coming up and see where they take the SIG in the next couple of years. So with that, we'll turn to our main event for today. I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Sarah Peko-Spicer, who's a researcher and meta-scientist at the American Institutes for Research. Sarah holds a BS in economics, statistics, and French, if I have that right, from Carnegie Mellon, and a PhD in statistics from Northwestern University, where she worked on problems in the optimal design of experiments and replication studies. So these are issues that are really intimately connected to research synthesis. But she's not just a methodologist, she's also been thinking about and pushing our fields of statistics and education research to think more deeply about how the methods that we use reproduce oppressive power structures and how our fields can shift towards using quantitative tools more critically and as tools for racial justice. Her work here has included co-organizing the Quant for What conference series, as well as founding the Researchers of Color group in the Society for Research on Educational Effectiveness. And her topic today, I think, brings together those interests in a really wonderful way. When she first told me about it about a year or so ago, I think, I thought, well, this is the most interesting and kind of audacious and bold systematic review project that I think I've ever heard of. So I'm really excited to hear about what she and her team have been up to. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Peko-Spicer.
James, I could cry. That's like the kindest introduction I've ever received, and I think made especially special receiving it from you. For those of you who don't know, James is like my academic big brother, so it feels nice to hear him say all of those things. And I might ask for a copy of that so I can just like send it to people the next time they ask me for a bio. Anyways, I'm really excited to be with you all today to talk about this project that a bunch of us dreamed up and just said, let's do it without thinking too hard about what that entailed. And now that we're in it, we're learning a lot of things that we've been eager to share with folks. So I should say that even like the name of this talk is a little off. We are a year into this project and I feel like we are still learning lots of lessons. So what I'm going to cover is kind of what we've learned so far. And I hope that I can cover a lot of it quickly because I'm looking around and I see a lot of the team members on this call. And so I'm hoping we can actually have a good amount of time at the end for just discussion where everyone can chime in. All right. So as like a quick roadmap, I feel like there are a few kinds of questions that we might be able to answer for folks so far. I'm going to start by just talking a bit about what we mean by participatory research. I think there's a lot of interest in this space, and I'm coming to learn people mean very different things in practice about what they're doing there. I'm going to talk a bit about why we might want to do participatory research and participatory evidence syntheses in particular. And then I'm going to talk about the steps we've taken on our team to do this work that we've proposed and some of the lessons that we've learned together. I'm also going to give the caveat that I've been saying to everyone, I've never given a talk quite like this before about a process or a product. So I'm going to be testing out a few different ways to talk about this and would be eager for feedback about what would have been a cool way to talk about this. So to start us off, just in general, there's this question of like, what is participatory research really? And I would say kind of at the highest level, participatory research is both a range of methods that you can use to do work with other people, but it's also, I think, mostly an epistemology. And I feel like I have colleagues who are probably rolling their eyes right now because I won't shut up about philosophy of science with them. But for those who need a little definition, an epistemology is kind of this idea of like, how do we know what we know and what are the ways that we build evidence and knowledge, like generate evidence and knowledge? And so I first want to point out that I think participatory work is both a methodology and an epistemology. And it's one in which people who are typically the subject of research become involved in the research process as co-researchers. Now, how does that happen? It varies. I can totally share slides, Rebecca. I see participatory research as something that exists on kind of a spectrum of engagement in research. And so on one end of the spectrum, we have, am I not sharing screen? Oh. So sorry. Can everyone see what I'm sharing now? I was so ready to go. I didn't even realize. Thank you for stopping me. So on one end of this spectrum, we have kind of what I would call interactive research. And this is research that engages participants, but maybe minimally and probably at like key touch points. I would put in this realm, like I know at AIR, we do a lot of projects where we have stakeholder advisory committees, and we might reach out to them at key stages of the project to get some feedback. But I think the important thing to know is at this like interactive end of the spectrum, research really is like, research is mine as the researcher. I kind of determine the agenda and the design. I share power on my own terms, right? Like I'm the one who decides when I'm reaching out to my stakeholders for feedback, and I'm ultimately the person who decides whether or not I incorporate that feedback. On the other end of the spectrum, we have this thing that I would call liberatory or emancipatory research. And in this case, I would say like a good way to think about this is research is theirs. This is a place where folks who are typically the subject of research, so let's just say community members broadly, they choose the inquiry, they choose the agenda, they choose the design, they enlist services of researchers when they feel they're needed. They decide what's done with the findings. And this is really a style of research where, like, as researchers, we completely relinquish our power and we are working totally in service of participants and community members. And I would say participatory research sits somewhere in between these two things. And I like to think of this as like research is ours. Traditionally in participatory research, people who are typically the subject of research are brought on. They co-develop the agenda with researchers. They do joint planning on the design. People will work together to carry out the research. figuring out what dissemination looks like is a shared responsibility, and power is really shared. We are calling what we're doing on our project right now a participatory project, although we are still struggling and figuring out where on the spectrum we are. I think there are parts of what we're doing that are really aligned with the goals of participatory research, and there are parts of what we're doing that may end up being a little more interactive. And I think that's just the nature of trying to get an evidence synthesis done. I'm gonna thank you. Checking the chat just to make sure there's no questions coming up. So what does this look like in practice? One of the reasons that I think James looked at me like, what are you thinking when I proposed this idea, is because usually when you see participatory research happening, it's often happening in primary research studies. And those studies might be ones that are focused on co-designing programs or interventions. There's a lot of participatory co-design kind of work going on. Or they might be primary studies where, you know, the kinds of inquiries that are coming up are ones that can be answered using surveys or interviews or things that researchers tend to believe are maybe easier to train and prepare people to do, although I don't think, as someone who's doing interviews for the first time, I don't think that's true. But I think they tend to be kind of coupled with qualitative research methods. And it's pretty rare to see participatory research being used in quantitative studies, and even rarer to see them being used in something like an evidence synthesis. That said, it's still like, we were surprised to find that there are people doing syntheses who are really engaging participatory methods. And so I want to share a bit about what they're doing before I start talking about what we're doing. So we have found that there are kind of these participatory syntheses being conducted in the public health space, and particularly in kind of like Australia and New Zealand, specifically thinking about inquiries involving Indigenous communities. In kind of the digging that I've done on this, what I found is, I think on that spectrum, these studies might be more aligned with what I would call interactive research. I think there's a lot of feedback cycles, and they spend a lot of time kind of pulling together focus groups of community members to help them think about research questions, to help identify inclusion-exclusion criteria and the like. But once the analysis begins, I think they kind of carry out the work and come back to communities post-analysis to do some sense making and determine this dissemination strategies together. We've also found that folks who do qualitative syntheses have been using participatory research methods for a while. So we found one study in particular in 2012 where the authors did a qualitative participatory synthesis on the impacts of virtual learning and higher education. I think one thing that I find really interesting about this synthesis is who they chose to identify as participants to bring on as co-researchers. And in this case, they looked to the folks who did the primary studies to bring them on to the synthesis process. And especially since qualitative syntheses involve a lot of kind of reading studies into each other to see what can be learned, they thought that this would be the most effective way to bring folks who are typically the topic of a meta-analysis or synthesis in order to make new meaning together. And so I also want to say that even who we consider to be the subjects of research who we want to bring on board really begins to vary once you get into the world of like meta research. Okay, so before I get into what our team is doing, I think it's really important to also talk about the why would you even try to engage these things, and particularly why you would try to engage this in something like meta research. And I think there's a lot of different reasons. And what excited me about this project is I feel like each team member came with maybe a different reason for wanting to be involved in this. So at one level, it allows you to engage people with all kinds of different expertise to produce knowledge about the world. And I know in particular, one of the things you'll hear people who do participatory research designs bring up is that oftentimes the communities that we're studying are not well represented among researchers. And this is a really nice way to get their own expertise about their lived experience, their communities, and their contexts into a project. I think another thing that it allows you to do is to share knowledge and research skills with lots of people and kind of give people the tools they need to investigate their own inquiries outside of a project space, which I think is really powerful. One thing we talked about as a team when we embarked on this is, as researchers, we're always trying to figure out why, like, we have all of this knowledge about what works, and we struggle to get people to put that knowledge into action. And one of the things that we're finding on our project is, you know, I'll talk about who we've brought onto it, but that it might open doors for us to have some faster, like, knowledge to action cycles together that would allow people to immediately implement what they're learning in their own contexts and spaces. And then two that I would really like to highlight, because they're consistent with kind of my own goals as a researcher, is that I think that this is one of the best tools we have to disrupt power dynamics that exist between researchers and communities, and in ways that can help us take steps towards data and research sovereignty. So if you think back to that kind of spectrum that I pointed out, I have a goal of making emancipatory and liberatory research the modal experience. And so to me, what excites me about participatory methods is that they kind of help us get there by constantly building up people's skills to answer their own inquiries and to feel like empowered to do research and reach out to researchers as needed. So those are my own goals in this space. Okay, so now to talk about the project that we're doing, which is a participatory synthesis on social and emotional learning programs. And I just want to give like a brief overview of where things stand now and what we kind of aim to look at. And then I'm going to talk to you about how we got to what's going to be up on these slides, because I think that has been the most interesting piece of this, is how we got there. So our project kind of consists of 3 strands. And before I describe the strands, I'll explain a bit of the motivation that Josh Palan and Dorothy Espelage and I came together. Well, they really came to me and asked if I wanted to be involved in this project that they were thinking about of, you know, it's been a while since we've seen someone revisit this literature on SEL. It feels like we're due for an update, especially since SEL programs and strategies have really, like, the adoption has really exploded recently. But they had also noticed that there was a lot of literature critiquing SEL and its implementation. And a lot of that literature was focused on kind of questioning, a lot of those critiques are critiques that point out that SEL might be so deeply rooted in whiteness and white supremacy in terms of kind of how it conceptualizes appropriate emotional and social behaviors, and that it might not, you know, we're investing a lot of money into these programs and strategies on the belief that they work for all students. And these critiques have begun wondering, like, well, do they? Are there groups of students that it might not be working well for, or maybe even be harming by encouraging them to adopt certain behaviors that are maybe inconsistent with their own cultural norms, beliefs, and practices? And so we really came to see, how can we look at the literature from that perspective of trying to get a little more nuanced of a take on who SEL is working for and in what contexts. So the first strand of work that we had kind of proposed and we'll be moving forward with is what we're calling a systematic equity review, which is, you know, similar to a systematic review, but I think we're trying to make sure that we take an equity lens to the questions that we're asking and kind of what we want to surface from the literature. And so some of the questions, these are just examples, we have many of them. So we're trying to consider the populations, geographical areas, and contexts that social emotional learning programs have even been evaluated. It's unclear to us, for instance, if people have thought about SEL in rural Indigenous communities and like what kind of evaluation is going on there. We've also talked about the extent to which, we want to explore the extent to which evaluations have described and tested the fit between the SEL design and theory of action, and then the populations in which the program is being implemented. And so that is like one strand of the work. The next strand of the work that has actually come out of this curriculum that we've all done together, we began realizing that there was a lot of questions that we had that we don't know that we're going to be able to find in the literature. And so we kind of plan on adding on some work to develop a survey for SEL program developers to help us understand what it might mean to them to have a culturally responsive SEL program, how they're thinking about that as they develop programs, what changes they might be making to existing programs to meet some of these calls for cultural responsiveness. And then two, what kinds of resources they think would be required to effectively implement a culturally responsive SEL program. And then our third strand that we're going to do is a differential effects meta-analysis, where we're really exploring the extent to which evaluations have even estimated the effect of SEL programs on, I say X outcomes, because we're still in the process of talking together and reaching consensus on the outcomes we want to consider. But for youth who are marginalized because of their race, and even that too, in our group, we've been discussing if there's other intersections or other kinds of identities that we want to explore this question in. And then should we surface studies where we can actually get at this, we want to learn about the average effects of SEL programs for those youth by each group, and then how those effects might vary with different kind of characteristics of the program or the implementation. And so when we had started this work, we had, as I said, strand 2 didn't exist. And we were also calling these phases. And I think one thing that's come out of this like participatory process together is not only have we introduced a new strand, and we've kind of talked about changes to questions within existing strands, but what we've learned is that this work is all going to feed each other in like a really interesting way. There's stuff that we have to do in strand 2 that will feed into strand 1 and strand 3, things in strand 1 that will feed into strand 3. And so it's like I think it has kind of changed even for folks who have been doing syntheses for a while, it's forcing us to kind of change our perspective on the process of the synthesis itself. Josh, I see you came on. Is there something you want to say right now?
No, I just stopped eating and I wanted to be supportive. So I'm back on video. Keep going.
Okay. So let me get to who's involved, because it is a large team. It is ever growing. There's actually a circle of folks who will be involved in this who's not included on this slide. But since we're talking about a participatory process, I have to just mention all the folks who are here, and some of whom are in the room with us. So from AIR, we get to do this work with Josh and Laura and Kamal, who's here, and Sophia, who's here, and Isabel, who's here. And even in this group, I think there's a lot of different kinds of expertise shining through. For instance, Sophia is not a synthesist and not a meta-analyst, but is a TA provider who did so much to help us think about what this curriculum should look like and how to best engage everyone through the process. So that in and of itself is a team that's bringing a lot of different things to the table. And then I'll say from UNC, and this is not a complete picture because some folks from UNC are also in this recruited participants category. But, oh, thank you, Rebecca. But from UNC, Dorothy Espelage I feel so blessed that we get to work with Dorothy. And she showed up with a whole team of graduate students and folks who are working in her lab, including Luz and Tati and Alex and Grayson. And I see Luz here, and I'm not sure that the other three were able to join, but just want to give a shout out. And then we have our participants who we recruited. And so the first 4 participants here, Hannah, Sharia, Anahi, and Karina, are all UNC undergraduate students. So when we started this project, we wanted to bring on 8 youth to do the work with us, which was, we learned, ambitious. In part because we had first started by saying we would really like to recruit youth from high schools, and we might work with some of the adults we recruited to sort that out. That immediately became quite challenging. It's hard to figure out scheduling. It's hard to figure out which high schools to even work with, to get people, you know, folks have existing relationships, and still, I think just the process of getting it set up was really challenging. Then at some point we realized Dorothy is teaching a class on SEL to undergraduate students, many of whom have probably experienced a lot of SEL courses or programs in their own K-12 experience. And so we decided to recruit these 4 students from that class. And you know, they're engaging in the whole process with us, and hopefully there will be opportunities for them to then take what they're experiencing and maybe work with Dorothy to facilitate some of that class in future sessions. So that's an exciting piece for us. And then the last 4 people that we've recruited are all adult participants in this. And I'm going to give a brief description of each one. So Dr. Zoe Heigl-Strong is a Native scholar who does a lot of work around SEL in Native and Indigenous communities. Dr. Rob Jagers is at Castle, which I want to give the whole like collaborative for, and I know I'm going to miss a word. I will just say that Castle is kind of a leading group that works hard on advocating for SEL adoption. They kind of do a lot of review of programs to determine what constitutes an SEL program. But Rob is the director of research at Castle and has done a lot of really important work in thinking about SEL and cultural responsiveness, and developed this transformative SEL framework that our team was really interested in. And then Eric Moore is an administrator and practitioner in Minneapolis Public Schools, and he oversees in the school district everything to do with SEL policy adoption and implementation. And he has been doing some really interesting work in his school district to bring together students, parents, and practitioners to inform what SEL implementation looks like in the district. So very excited to have him. And then finally, Dr. Aja Baruti Goodwin is a postdoc based in Baltimore, but she also is a practicing school mental health clinician. And we really wanted to get that perspective on this project. I'm gonna pause. Thank you. The chat is just everyone following up with extra information. I so appreciate you. All right, so when we brought all of these people together, we were initially like, great, we're gonna hit the ground running and do the work. And then Sophia and one of our advisors, Femi Vance, said, pause. You can't do that. everyone here has such different kinds of expertise. You're going to be working with people who've never done a synthesis. Have you even bothered to pause and ask them if like these are the questions that they would have too about the project? And so we pulled back, and under their guidance, we decided that the best thing for us to do to kick off this project would be to have a 10-week curriculum together. And when we started this, we set out and said, okay, this will be a good way for us to build relationships with all of these people coming from different parts of their life, different institutions. Like, we need to do some relationship building. And I think we also, at the time, were thinking of like, this will be a great way to teach people about meta-analysis and teach people who maybe haven't been in this space about SEL. And so I'm gonna kind of give an overview of what we did week to week in the curriculum, and then I'm going to share some of the things that came out of that, or some of the things that we used, to just give you all a vibe. So the first 2 weeks of this, we really wanted to focus in on the relationships that we wanted to build. The first week was really just like getting to know each other, and talking about the work that we proposed doing together. In week 2, we moved on to conversations about power dynamics, how we were going to make decisions as a team, and then also spent some time identifying shared values together. Over the next 3 weeks, we shifted focus into diving deep into SEL, because a lot of the folks who were involved, myself included, were new to that space. So we spent a week kind of learning about the basics of SEL programs and traditional SEL. The next week, we kind of talked about this transformative SEL framework that Rob and others have been developing. And then in week 5, we had this really rich conversation about how you would even identify SEL programs in the literature. And this took off in lots of directions, especially as participants were sharing reflections of just how many things could count as an SEL program. So we began talking about mindfulness programs and restorative justice programs, and like different kinds of pedagogical approaches that are being used in schools, like project-based learning or YPAR, youth participatory action research in schools, could be, you know, examples of SEL programs. So we spent some time discussing that together. In the next set of weeks, we were originally just going to dive right into kind of what is a systematic review and what is a meta-analysis. And then we realized that just to start, we needed to talk about like, what is evidence and what is knowledge? How do we know what we know? Like we felt like we really needed to start in that space to recognize that this is just one way of, you know, an evidence synthesis is looking at a particular kind of evidence and is one way of building knowledge, but we recognize that there are many, and all of those things can kind of inform where we go together as a group. So we did that before getting into the purpose and process of systematic reviews, and then the purpose and process, Shannon, I will get there, yep, of meta-analysis. And then in our last 2 weeks, we spent a week revisiting our shared values and talking about how we kind of plan to use them to guide us through our project and hold ourselves accountable to each other in the work. And I'm going to show you what that ended up looking like. And then we spent the last week coming to consensus on our research questions. And that is something that has like bled into where we are now and is ongoing. And I'm going to show you that too. So to get to Shannon's question about like, whoa, this is a lot. How long and how much time is this taking? So each session that we did was about an hour and a half long. Originally, we had talked about doing an hour, and I think we immediately realized there was no way that that was going to work. So we shifted to hour-and-a-half sessions. All participants kind of completed some homework prior to each session. And for that, I would say there was about a half hour of homework that people were asked to do. And I'll show you examples of those. The sessions were co-developed with Kamal and Luz and Tati. So mostly graduate students were leading the front on developing this under the guidance of Sophia, who was helping us think through kind of, is this the right way to engage folks and how can we make this more kind of interactive? And then they were co-facilitated by one of the developers and then often a participant. And so Luz, for instance, can talk about later if folks are interested. Luz facilitated with one of the undergraduate students that we recruited to the project. So we tried to make space to even begin that kind of like sharing and leadership in the context of this curriculum. All the sessions were discussion-based and activity-based. That was like what we tried to spend the majority of our time on, with maybe some like brief recaps of what the homework was and like mini lectures to start. And then all participants were encouraged to complete a reflection survey after each session that in part gave us feedback on what we needed to change session to session to make it more engaging or to facilitate learning. And in part was a way to capture kind of how our orientations to the work and the topics were changing over time. So I am going to exit out of this to show you a bit of what this looked like. Because I think too, what I didn't mention in that slide is developing this was like a months long, maybe like a year-long process, to be honest. And so I would love to show folks a bit of what we developed. So I'll start with kind of, I mentioned our homework that we had people do. So everyone on the project received 2 workbooks. We kind of broke our workbooks into 5-week like groups for each of the 5 weeks. Everyone received a 2 workbook that included all of the activities that they would have to do prior to the session, any materials that we thought would be helpful for them during the session, including the slides that we put together, or any kind of like, if we used a Jamboard, they would get links to that, and a place for them to take notes. And so I'll skip so you can see kind of what some of these activities might have been. You know, in that week 1 for getting to know each other, we asked people to review the proposal and take some notes about any thoughts or questions that they had about their proposal. We also did this tree of strength activity where we asked them to kind of reflect on using this like beautiful tree picture about just people and places that are significant in their lives, values and concepts that guide you in life, strengths and skills they feel like they possess, achievements and goals. And so all of our first session was kind of rooted in getting to know each other through this activity. I think another good one to highlight might be like, as we got into the SEL space, Luz and Tati had put together some activities to just get people a quick introduction to some of the kind of core ideas in SEL. We also had they did a great job of giving us like actual activities that students might be doing in their classes through different programs. So we each got some time before a session, for instance, to go through what like a lesson might be for a student. And so everyone got this workbook, and that was a huge part of the development. So then we also had to spend a lot of time pulling together kind of lesson plans and then, you know, slide decks for each of these sessions. And so I wanted to give an example of kind of like what, for instance, our week 2 on decision-making and power sharing looked like. That was a week that involved a little mini lecture on research ethics and power, introducing people to maybe the duty ethics of IRB, but also introducing people to other ethical frameworks that you can use in research, and particularly ethical frameworks that exist in participatory research. And you can see here, then we had 2 like big activities that we would do together. One was to help us kind of understand different approaches to decision-making together. So, you know, we talked about autocratic decision-making, we talked about representative decision-making, we talked about democratic decision-making and consensus building, and we talked about, in the context of working as a group on this project, what kinds of decisions we might want to use these different strategies for. So it was helping to kind of lay the foundation as we move forward, having an agreement about how we want to make decisions so that people don't feel later on like they're being left out of a process or that their voices aren't being heard through the process. And then we wrapped up this session in identifying our shared values. So this was a session where like the pre-homework activity was for people to identify some core values that they hold in life. And we ended the session by tossing all of those things up onto a Jamboard and spending some time trying to determine where there's overlap and what kinds of things we all really believe in that we might be able to come around to as guideposts for the work that we do together. So, and then, as I said, each session kind of ends with like a reflection, just something we just did through Google Forms. And I mentioned, right, that some of our reflection questions are just like, how do we make this process better? But then some of them are asking people to dig a little deeper. And I think that actually, and I'd be curious to hear from others in the room who were involved in this, I found that some of the reflection questions were, based on what I saw, I was seeing the most growth among our researchers who were being challenged to think about their role in very new ways and challenged to think about the scientific process in very new ways. And that was really exciting for me to see, like, that this isn't only a curriculum that was helpful to people who are new to this space, but a curriculum that was supporting a lot of introspection, reflection, and growth among people who've been around for a while. Okay, I'm gonna try to get through a few last things because I do want to like talk to people. I think a really key component of what we've done that is like what I want to share with everyone, getting around these shared values has been really, really helpful and really illuminating. And so I just want to point out 2 documents that we plan to ground our work in so that we're able to work effectively together. One is our values definition table, where you can see we have a value that we've all agreed upon and on the far left. And then everyone has kind of adopted a little color where they've been able to kind of articulate for others what the value means to them, how they would define it, and why it's important to them. I think right now, this isn't something that we have to use a lot, but what I anticipate is in moments of conflict or miscommunication, which are bound to arise on a team this large with such different experiences, that this is going to serve as a really great grounding device to help us work through that. And then the other way that we've used these values is to help us think about, if we really want to engage in value-driven work together, now we want to figure out how to kind of map that onto different phases of the project. And so we've put together what is called a structured ethical reflection grid, where we have in this one different phases of a systematic review across the columns and our values across the rows. And we've been doing some thinking together about, for instance, what it means to practice empathy with each other and the work when we're formulating research questions. Or, you know, one of the things that we talked about in this realm of empathy is in screening studies, like what does it mean to practice empathy? And someone brought up like, man, sometimes I'm screening studies and I get really frustrated with study authors that they didn't include the information I needed. And we had this whole conversation of like, what does it look like to practice empathy in that moment and extend grace and know that like the study author gifted you with something and a lot of information, and like, how do we appreciate the work that they put into that? And so we've been using this as kind of a device for us to check in with ourselves and each other throughout the project. Very last thing I'm going to say, well, second to last thing I'm going to say, We've also, as we've been testing out different decision-making strategies, you might wonder how we're making decisions about things like research questions and inclusion exclusion criteria when we have such a large group. Right now, one mechanism we're testing out is using kind of surveys to do some democratic decision-making, get some yays or nays on our research questions now that we've had some consensus building done. And also, like, as we begin thinking about our inclusion exclusion criteria, right now we're at a stage of just trying to identify if there's things that we are all in agreement on and we can move forward with, or things where if someone disagrees, we need to come to the table and have like a little consensus building conversation to make sure that we can move forward with inclusion criteria that everyone's agreeing on. So then the very last thing I'll say about lessons learned, at least on my end, and I'm sure other people who are involved in the project could add to this. One of the things I'm realizing is this curriculum ended serving many more purposes than we had initially envisioned. As I said, we thought of it as like, this might be a good way to build people's skills up before we get started, and it might be a good way to build relationships. I don't think we had anticipated in the same way that it would be a sort of disorientation for researchers, getting them to question their own training and their own beliefs about science and even their own beliefs about syntheses. And that has been really exciting. I think it's also been a cool way to kind of, one thing we've learned is that it's given us the space to practice what we're studying and preaching. We've been applying a lot of SEL in trying to do this together. And I think we've all been really excited that this is giving us an opportunity to build our own social emotional learning competencies and skills while we are studying what it looks like to build those skills, and giving us a lot of new insights from that perspective. But must admit, certainly not without its challenges. And I've thrown a few of those up here. Scheduling is hard. I think if we were to do this again, we might have started with a smaller group in our first time out. It is really difficult getting everyone to the table. One of the things we're going to try moving forward, I identified those 3 strands that we're going to work in, and we've decided to kind of have people pick strands they're most interested in an effort to allow us to have meetings strand by strand that are a little smaller, maybe easier to schedule. Facilitating large groups in a virtual setting is really, really hard. I think balancing breadth and depth in those curriculum sessions was also a challenge. I think it's really easy to want to like spend 4 hours talking about transformative SEL alone, and recognizing that we need to like talk about other things too was sometimes difficult. Similarly, there were some things where we were like the details of a synthesis or the details of a meta-analysis that we were constantly struggling with. How deep do we go into this? Like, what is the right level of engagement at this point in time? Paying youth, I think that there's a lot about the ways that institutions are set up that make paying youth and getting them set up and in the system and paying them in a timely manner really, really challenging. And we did our best, but like we had youth working well before we were able to pay them. And that was something that was really difficult for us. And then just the amount of time. I think we thought that this would be like we'll develop these things and then 10 weeks and then we're moving on. And as I said, this has been like a year of our project has just been doing this. And I think now that we've done it, it would be much easier to do it again and make it a shorter process. But as a first go round, a lot of time. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Love to hear questions or thoughts, or if team members have something that they're like, Sarah, you forgot this, you should shout out.
Since no one has a question, I can ask one. What, and yes, I agree with Amy, this is really new, innovative, exciting work. I was just wondering if you think that there are topics that are suited to this kind of approach and topics that might not be. Just sort of like where, like how different from SEL can you get and still apply a similar framework?
That's a good question. I don't know that I thought about that. My instinct is to say, so long as you're studying, like everything that we study impacts someone. Like, you know, and I think from that perspective, I can't think of a topic that I would say, I don't think that this would work. There might be different kinds of challenges. I'm on another project where it's a primary study and we're doing some PAR work, and it's around the criminal justice system and youth involvement in the criminal justice system. And I think there's different kinds of challenges there and different things we need to think about in terms of trauma and like how we structure things to hold space for trauma and to not, you know, reproduce trauma. So I guess my feeling is that like, I can't think of a topic that you wouldn't be able to do with this. I just think that how you do it might have to shift and who you do it with.
There's a question from Lillian. This is incredible. How do you plan to share the study processes and outcomes results? Do you envision disseminating certain stages as you continue to work with others, especially thinking of how much time this is taking?
Yeah, so the dissemination is like a bit of this like building the plane while we fly thing. So there's, you know, some of this we're working on right now together, and especially the folks who were involved in developing this curriculum. We're trying to think about a paper to write together about what that was like and what the process of being a part of it is. And so we've been exploring some new writing styles for all of us, you know, like maybe thinking about narrative summaries of this is something we're exploring. And with the rest of the dissemination, we're really just focused on working with our team to identify the dissemination strategies that they think would be best. So I think there's going to be like a lot of the typical, we'll talk about this at conferences, we'll write papers on it, but you know, we think about where each of our team members are located and what we might do that would be most helpful in their environment. So for instance, working with Eric Moore in his district to see how we can use what we're learning to support the work that he's doing with students, families, and teachers in his district is something that we're trying to explore. Or, you know, Rob at Castle has a lot of different things going on that we could maybe tap into and kind of help figure out dissemination strategies there that would be most useful. Terry, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, my question was actually about what you just said, which I think one of the really exciting parts of your work is going to be about dissemination, about how we can make that cycle, as you talked about at the beginning, quicker. And so I was wondering if, you know, what some of your participants have been saying about, or have they been able to anticipate how they might be able to use the information that you're beginning to generate, you know, right back into practice? Yeah.
I think our adult participants, yes. I think like after the third week, I had separate conversations with almost each of them where they were just generating like, oh, I'd like to do this and this and this. And so I think for them, it's very clear. And two, like they're thinking about touch points that they're not all touch points at the end of the project. I think they can see things right now as the work develops that would be great touch points in their spaces. I think with some of our like youth participants, like our undergraduate participants, you know, it might take time, but we've been talking about like what's going on UNC's campus where you see this fitting in. Like, are there things going on in student groups where like you might be able to take lessons from this into work that you do in student groups, and that could be really cool. Or, you know, as they're thinking ahead to their careers, like what lessons are they learning here that might even just be informative for their careers? You know, I think sometimes even just those critical connections can be so helpful in changing a landscape.
Sarah, could you say anything more about anything you've learned about negotiating like expertise and authority in doing this work? Because it seems like, right, like, you know, systematic review and research synthesis, especially, like there's this like very strong streak of like authoritative guidance on like, this is the correct way to do things.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to hear from like Josh or Laura about that. And just because I'm thinking that or Josh, Laura, and Dorothy, I think, are the three people on our team who have the most experience doing syntheses and for whom they might have the most to say on that. So I'm going to let them respond if they have a response, but I can also say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I can't imagine doing it very well without someone like Sarah in a leadership role on the project. I think it takes a lot of grace and humility about what your roles are and the kind of dynamics that exist and awareness of what you're stepping into. So I think that personality matters a lot. It's not a very satisfying answer, but that was what immediately came to mind for me.
Well, I'll also share then actual strategies that I think helped. One of them being that we spent, like, I was adamant that we had to spend time early on talking about adultism, talking about power, talking about decision-making. Like, those are things that I felt conversations we couldn't shy away from, and layering on the complexity of, like, we know we're proposing a thing and a method that some people know how to do really well and some people have never done. And I think we've been very conscious of like highlighting for folks how, while there are complex things about it, you know, I don't know that we're going to train everyone up on actually carrying out the analysis itself, right? But that there are things I think highlighting for folks that, like, making decisions about inclusion exclusion criteria, there's no reason why we should be the only ones to do it. Yeah. You know, and so I think making that clear from the start was really helpful. I think too, I know personally, spending the time thinking about the values and hearing what it means to everyone and having those documents to check in on has been very useful for me in times when I'm like wondering, am I being a dictator about something? Like going back and seeing like, okay, am I adhering to these values at this stage? Like, what could I be doing differently? I think has been useful for kind of navigating those dynamics.
Question in the chat from Kehinde. Please, what perspective and philosophy informed your idea of SEL?
Idea of SEL. That's challenging. I mean, before Dorothy and Josh reached out to me, I'm a statistician by training, as you may have heard in James's introduction. SEL was an entirely new content area to me. I think though, if I were to say like what informed me personally, as it does in all things, I think that I try to root my practice as a researcher in a number of critical theories, including things like Black feminism, including things like critical quantitative approaches. And so I think my perspective coming into this is always grounded in those theories. And I certainly have an orientation to most things of kind of training a lens on where whiteness and white supremacy arises and why, and what can be done to counteract that. And so I think in taking in the SEL literature, those are always questions that I'm asking, but that's what I ask of most literatures when I get introduced to them.
And Sean Grant notes in the chat, if you haven't engaged with them, you might find a lot of friends and colleagues in the Muse Consortium at Cochrane.
Love that. Thank you. I should also say, and I left them off of our little who's involved, but another beautiful thing that has come out of this that I think is also going to lead to some cool, perhaps methodological developments through this process. You know, we found out that there was a group at Yale led by Chris Cipriano, who was also publishing and beat us to publishing an evidence synthesis, a systematic review and meta-analysis on social emotional learning programs. And I think that momentarily like knocked the wind out of our sails until we were able to meet with her and her team. And I think a really beautiful collaboration is now coming out of that. I think we're now kind of shifting gears into figuring out how we can build on what her and her team have done and what she is surfacing as an update and evolution, which I really like of their work, in ways that allow us to dive deeper into some of these like kind of context driven and TSCL and equity oriented questions. And so that too has been, I think through this, we just keep finding people who we get to bring on and work with. And it's been lovely.
That's super cool. I'm afraid we're out of time, but Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. This has been really, really interesting. So next month is the AERA convention. So hope to see some of you maybe in person in Chicago or online at AERA. And then we will reconvene the seminar in May with Josh Polanin talking about Meta Reviewer. Thanks all for coming.
Wow, what an idea.
Great job, Sarah.